Yeah, I think sometimes, like you said, the language for whatever domestic violence means to a kid, right? How we ask questions, how we say things, it's so hard.
Yes.
Talking to kids is hard in general, right? When we have to have serious conversations. And then when you bring in a topic like domestic violence or abuse, it can feel scary to say and acknowledge. And one of my favorite kind of like mantras comes from child parent psychotherapy. The intervention is we are there to speak the unspeakable and to say the hard things.
Yeah.
Because even if it feels uncomfortable, kids know.
Yeah.
Kids were there, they heard, they saw, they sensed, they felt what was in the room. And so as adults, if we can name what they experienced and give them a safe space to process that, the parent or the caregiver-child relationship is going to move so much more, right? The understanding, the understanding of each other's experiences, specifically the caregiver understanding this is how my youth, my kid really process everything and what they need is huge.
Welcome to the Domestic Abuse Project podcast. And I'm Denise. I'm a youth therapist at DAP.
And I'm Ciara. I am also a youth therapist at DAP. But we also work in all the programs.
Yeah, we have lots of different roles, lots of different hats we wear. But today we're here to talk about youth group and what youth group looks like. So why don't you tell us a little bit about the format of youth group, how long it is, just basic information.
Yeah, so Denise and I are both therapists in youth group, and our youth group is 10 weeks long. So it really starts with everyone coming in, getting to know each other, getting to know the space. But it's really focused on domestic violence and how domestic violence isn't a kid's fault. And that talking about parent fighting in their home is okay, and there's safe places to do that. So it's 10 weeks. We have dinner. We provide dinner for everyone. It's my favorite part. We do big group games, but then also I think one of my favorite parts and what makes it so special is that youth have a time to go into a group room with a therapist, kind of in their specific age group, but then also caregivers, maternal caregivers, have a chance to do that as well.
Yeah. So there's usually up to 3 youth-centered groups. So it's separated by ages. And the max age that we do is 12.
Yeah.
And the youngest we have are like 6. And then, so they go into their separate groups and be with kids at their own age and start talking about the group topic for the day. And those group topics look like, anger. Another time we talk about, the abuse is not your fault and fighting in the home. So each week there's a group topic that we discuss. And the maternal caregivers go in their own group, like Ciara was saying, and go over that topic as well through the context of raising kids and how domestic violence impacts children and what they can do as maternal caregivers to support them and support themselves too while they're parenting through, this whole process.
Yeah.
What do you think is your favorite part about youth group, working with the kids?
Yeah. I think we do so much work with kids. I've really come to love the caregiver part.
Because you do the caregiver group, right?
Yes. Yep. So I run the caregiver group, kind of the breakout session. And I think what we talk about, the analogy I use a lot with them is a suitcase analogy. So we all carry our own suitcases. And when we go through domestic violence or domestic abuse, more stuff is added to our suitcase. So it's a lot harder to carry. And it's the job of a caregiver, whether it's a grandparent, an aunt, a mom, a foster parent, to really help kids organize the suitcase and understand their experiences. But what's so hard for caregivers is that as we help kids carry their suitcase, our suitcase, we're also holding that. And it often spills open, right? You set those suitcases down at home, and what's in your suitcase, your experiences and your truths and everything might spill out. And it might spill out into the kids. And we really, really dig into that. So that's been my favorite part. Because it's messy, it's hard. Parenting is hard, but then parenting when there's been domestic violence in the home is really challenging.
Yeah, absolutely. What do you think are some of the most common worries that get brought up in that group?
Yeah, I think big worries, big emotions are the shame guilt. The shame guilt that survivors hold for what their kids had to witness, what their kids had to experience, and maybe what they felt was their fault. I think other common themes that come up is how, as parents, right, who have parents or caregivers who have seen domestic violence, how do I set boundaries, right, that don't feel inappropriate or don't feel like they're stepping across a boundary that I don't like. So that comes up a lot. But I think my favorite part about it is similar to youth work in that it's messy.
Yeah, it is messy.
Yeah.
I think it's been cool to see, because I work with the kids in the youth group. You do the maternal caregivers this last round at least. And just seeing the difference in how parents and kids respond to certain topics has been really interesting. And how much resiliency I've seen in the kids. Yeah. You know, especially with some of the harder topics, some like about specific things, like seeing violence in the home or experiencing abuse themselves. They've really administered different ways of coping. You know, some can be healthy, some can be, you know, things that they've just learned and they're learning how to not do anymore. And it's been rewarding to see parents, you know, surprised that, oh, my kid really is resilient. Yeah. You know, and not broken. I didn't break them. Yes. You know?
Yeah. Okay, Denise, what is one of your favorite, maybe it's like topics or activities you do with the kids in the youth group?
Yeah. I really like when we do arts and crafts. Yeah. And different ways of expressing themselves with certain topics, because kids are so creative and like find different ways to express themselves with different symbolism and, you know, creations that they make. We do like a anger volcano. Oh, and we talk about different things that go in our volcano, what makes it erupt, things like that. And kids just get really into it. And they also really love drawing. I've seen lots of different pictures that, you know, are talking about some pretty, you know, hard stuff that they've experienced or witnessed. And being able to share that with other kids, I've just seen them feel so much less alone. You know, and other kids saying, oh, yeah, I've experienced that too, or this happened to me. You know, it brings them together in a way that they probably wouldn't in other situations or other places. And it creates like this little community where they really get to know each other and feel safe with each other. Yeah, I think that's my favorite part.
Yeah, I like how you spoke to the group of it, because it's DAP's philosophy that we heal in groups. And so it's cool to see with youth, right? Youth who maybe came and have had individual therapy or have had support at school to process what they've seen. But to be able to go in a group where it's like, wow, other kids have seen what I have or have witnessed what I have. And here we are to support each other, right? And heal through it together. Yeah. So yeah, I'm glad you brought up that part.
Absolutely.
It's so powerful.
And seeing them communicate with each other and start practicing boundaries within the group itself too. One of my favorite things that I remember is in youth group, someone shared something and kids were curious and were like asking questions. And the kid said, you can ask me 3 questions and that's it. And so he let people ask 3 questions and he said, okay, I'm done. That's all I want to share. And I'm like, good for you. Yeah. You set your boundary and said, this is all that I am willing to share, and let's move on. And I thought that was really cool to see just such young kids, like learning how to do that with each other and respecting those boundaries. None of the kids were like, no, I want to ask another. They're like, okay, and moved on. And it was really great to see. And I think the fact that we incorporate play and like, you know, fun things too within the group creates that environment of safety, trust, and being willing to explore uncomfortable feelings. Yeah. You know, because that can be really hard. It for some kids, it may not have been safe, you know, to express themselves or to dive into these topics. So it's really cool to be a part of that. Yeah. Yeah. And I think speaking to the safe part, right, is what we often find, some of the cases coming, right, there's a lot of systems involvement, a lot of kids who have been, who have been in the system, right, and are trying to navigate their experiences. And so it's really important to us, as providers,
to support them, and having a neutral space that is safe for them to share their things, and doesn't necessarily leave the room unless it has to, right? Unless it's something we have to report. But I think them knowing, wait, here's a space, here's other kids, here's people who will just sit and listen to some of the things I haven't been able to say or I'm scared to say,
right,
because of all the different systems and components in their life is huge.
Yeah. Another thing on safety, I want to get what you think about this. Something that comes up a lot with caregivers that I see in my individual therapy is the difference between safety and discomfort.
Yeah.
And so, labeling things as, oh, that's not safe, this is not safe, shifting that language to, oh, that's really uncomfortable, here are the consequences of whatever action, if you touch a hot stove, you're going to get burnt. So how does that show up in your groups with caregivers?
Yeah. Well, I think that's a really good question, because one of the biggest things that comes up with caregivers is they sometimes have to co-parent with the person who they've experienced abuse and violence from. And that's really hard. And so their concepts and their understanding and perception of what's safe versus maybe what's uncomfortable for the kids comes up so much. One of my favorite images I like to talk to caregivers about is like a shield. So imagine you're a knight and you have a shield, and how, as caregivers, it's our job, it's their job to be the protective shield, be the protective shield for the kids, right? And so when there's been domestic violence, abuse, that protective shield, it's broken down a little, right? There might be a hole in it, there might be scratches or tears, right? So how do they recreate that protective shield for them, right? Repair their relationship, show that, yes, as a provider, I'm gonna take care of you, right? I'm gonna keep you safe. But what's really, really hard then is sometimes as they are repairing this shield, they think that their kids then can experience uncomfortable things, right? And it's really normal to be like, is this, after going through a trauma, right? Is this really unsafe, or is this uncomfortable, right? Our brains have changed, our perception of safety has changed. And so we really explore those dynamics. What is truly unsafe for the kids versus what's uncomfortable and going to, in the long run, show growth, right? Speaking to the resilience in kids you talked about.
That made me think about when we did safety plans in group, and the differences that you pointed out about the maternal caregivers group and then what we saw with the kids. Kids knew what to do. They created those safety plans. They were like, yep, I do this, go here. They knew exactly what to do when something was dangerous or a scenario that they've been in before. What did you notice about parents?
That's a good question. So the parents' response was almost opposite, right? It was, they had a lot of fear, a lot of guilt and shame come up about even having their kids to have a safety plan, right? The thought of, because of what my kid's gone through, right? Because of a relationship I might have been in, they now have to have a safety plan that like details where they should go, who they can talk to, right? And that shame and guilt was really, really holding on to them, and it was something they couldn't let go. But then the cool thing about youth group is afterwards, right? Kids do their activity, caregivers do their activity, and they get to ask, right? They get to be like, what did your safety plan look like, right? And I think what a lot of caregivers then learn is the kids have these things, right? And if we get stuck in our guilt and shame from the past, we're not going to be able to move to the future, right? And so how do we acknowledge that, kids have that plan and they're resilient, and I'm going to keep moving forward with them. Denise, can you talk a little bit about how at DAP we kind of work with people who are maybe just getting started with programming and kind of what that journey looks like and what's the first step?
So some kids in the program and adults in the program, youth group is their first experience with therapy, experience talking about abuse, talking with other people about abuse. So it can be like very intimidating, very scary at first for the kids and the adults. And then we have some people who have been in individual therapy before, or were one of our clients individually, and now they're moving into youth group, and that's kind of like their next step, and kind of where we see them growing even more. So we have people coming from many different parts of the journey. And I think that's beautiful because we learn from each other's wisdom. And I see that in the kids too, of learning like, oh, this is what I did. Or, the kids are learning from each other. Really, the facilitators are there to foster conversation and to ask questions, but the kids are really the one doing the work. And I could probably say the same for adults, that they're really holding each other accountable and healing within each other from their own wisdom. So we really welcome wherever somebody is in their journey. Youth group is always open. And then after youth group, if you haven't had individual therapy before, we have lots of clients who do the 10-week youth group and then go into individual therapy. We have clients who were in individual, then do group, and then go back to individual. And we have clients who did individual for a while, did group, and then they said, I don't really think we need anything more. And I think that's beautiful too, because we don't want the kids or adults to feel like they need therapy forever. We really try to make sure that people feel empowered by their own wisdom and know that they can keep moving forward. They don't need us. And hopefully youth group is that, little boost of, okay, we got this. My kids got this. I've got this. Let's move forward. But we're here to support in any way we can.
Can you speak to like a specific growth you've seen like a client or a group member make from like the first day of group to like the last day of group?
Yes. I've seen, this has come up with a few kids actually, where, like I said, at the beginning, it's really scary to talk about things that have happened that, some kids, they've been told, don't talk about this with anybody else for right reasons. And so now we're throwing them in a group saying, okay, let's talk openly about it. And that can be really intimidating. So I've seen kids be very guarded, very like, I'm not going to talk about this. I'm not going to engage. Some kids show it in different ways. Some kids are very active and like try to, deter the conversation away. And so they get distracted with other things. Some kids are more quiet and get reserved. Some kids hide. Like there's different reactions to discomfort, right? But I really have seen in probably all of the kids that I've worked with this easing into, okay, I'm getting used to the people around me. I don't have to overshare, if I don't want to. There are adults in this room who are here to listen, and I can talk about these things. And once they start getting that message that abuse is not their fault and that we're talking about it now to heal and to process and grow, I've seen kids just dive right into the topic, you know, and inspire others to do that too. Like if a kid is more reserved, I've seen their peers like say, it's okay, you can talk about it if you want. If you don't have to. And that's so beautiful. And it just goes to show that kids are so much more wise than we give them credit for. And I have seen the relationships between caregivers and children, like when I see them at dinner and everything, that has blossomed too, of just like this trust and almost like taking a deep breath and letting go. Like the first dinner, it usually feels like very like everybody's like, I don't know, he's just getting used to the space. The last dinner, we do like a little celebration for everybody, a family celebration. And it's just so much more like, whew, we got through the 10 weeks together and we went through a lot. We processed a lot pretty quickly. I mean, 10 weeks seems like a long time, but it really is, it goes by quickly. So just seeing them together and having those conversations, it's so cool. Like hearing caregivers talk to you, say, oh, we talked about this in the car on the way home. And like, just knowing that those conversations are being had outside of session 2 is great.
I think sometimes, like you said, the language for whatever domestic violence means to a kid, right? How we ask questions, how we say things, it's so hard. Talking to kids is hard in general, right? When we have to have serious conversations. And then when you bring in a topic like domestic violence or abuse, it can feel scary to say and acknowledge. And one of my favorite kind of like mantras comes from child parent psychotherapy. The intervention is, we are there to speak the unspeakable, and to say the hard things. Because even if it feels uncomfortable, kids know. Kids were there, they heard, they saw, they sensed, they felt what was in the room. And so as adults, if we can name what they experienced and give them a safe space to process that, the parent or the caregiver-child relationship is going to move so much more, right? The understanding, the understanding of each
Yeah.
other's experiences, specifically the caregiver understanding this is how my youth, my kid really process everything and what they need is huge.
Yeah, absolutely.
Can you speak to kind of the generational cycle we might see with domestic violence a little more?
Yeah, so a few of the families that go through youth group, the parents have experienced domestic abuse too in their childhood or have witnessed it, and so sometimes there's generations of this cycle of domestic abuse, and it's generational trauma, right? And so really honing in on that generational piece and being able to metabolize that trauma, because a lot of times trauma is just sitting in our body and we haven't really been given the space or the time, or maybe there's shame and guilt about processing that trauma. And so it's so important for breaking the cycle, to give yourself that space and allow yourself permission to heal and to feel. And there's cycles. I mean, just like with any therapy, symptoms are expected to increase at the beginning because you're opening up a can of worms that you've been
big wound
you've been hiding away forever that you never wanted to see again. And so symptoms usually go up, but then we see a significant decrease because you're starting to process and you're starting to confront the things that are held in your body and your mind and have been there for generations, that we carry from our mother or our mother's mother. And so youth group can be a great first step, or for some step on the journey to do that, and to have other people in the community support you and other people who understand. That can be so helpful when opening up that can of worms that nobody wants to open up.
Yeah. I think a question I ask kind of on the same lines a lot of caregivers is if they have experienced or witnessed domestic violence during their childhood, what did they need that they didn't get?
Yeah.
And how do they be that for their kids now, right? To truthfully and openly and authentically end that cycle, right? It's hard. When you've grown up and that's what you're used to, right? You've seen communication and conflict handled in a means that is abusive or violent. It can be what you know, right? And for kids to say, this isn't normal, right? It doesn't have to be like this. And here are the skills, here are the ways you can build a relationship. So to see really what it can look like.
Right.
And so I think the caregiver space, we talk a lot about that, and how to support the kids too, and knowing what they want when they're in a relationship, when they're older, and how do you treat others, right? It's these are concepts and like morals most parents want their kids to have, right? Absolutely. And so, I like how you also spoke to the kind of the decrease in symptoms and behaviors. Opening up is hard right away. That increase in symptoms and behaviors might be there. And that's good.
Yeah. I think we also, talk about healthy relationships, what those look like. Everybody has to learn that.
Yes.
Everybody's a little, we all need a little refresher on healthy relationships and healthy ways to cope, because we fall into these, patterns that maybe we've seen growing up, or things that we're just grasping at straws because we're in survival mode. We also talk a lot about the difference between validating the feeling and what the behavior is. Because that's where, the abuse comes in, where the behavior, the response to what you're feeling is unhealthy and toxic. The feeling itself can be valid. And so that's what we talk about with the kids, is that being more emotionally aware of what is actually going on. What do you feel? And then what do you do with that feeling? Where do you put it? How do you process it? Most adults don't know how to do that, because it's not, typically talked about a lot. I'm seeing that culture slowly change, I think. But kids have that basic understanding, and they can either grow with it or start to suppress it. And sometimes in the middle, some kids are like, ooh, I don't know. And they know how to switch it up between spaces. And they're very, they can be hypervigilant. But I think that knowing those differences and being able to validate the feeling and the emotion is really important.
Yeah. And I like how you kind of commented too on the early intervention, right? Like I don't need to speak to all the science that there is behind that early intervention, getting people the supports and the services they need early on in their life has such an extreme benefit for their future, right? Their brains are still developing.
Yes.
In all these beautiful and unimaginable ways. And so when we can give them those supports and services, it doesn't have to be therapy, right? It can be a lot of different things, but therapy is really helpful, right? Then it gives them so much more, more hope and growth in the future.
Yep. And also access. Access is so important, and access to places, like therapy, community-based programs, places where it is a safe space to talk. That's why it's so scary about federal funding getting cut and not being able to have the money to give access to people who normally wouldn't have it, or, have never explored what feelings look like, or, have never explored the abuse or trauma they have experienced. That's why these things are so important, and community is so important to start getting rid of the stigma and talking about it and ending the cycle of violence. I think that's extremely important.
Yeah, and because what we know about domestic violence is it's not just a family problem, it's a community problem, right? Yeah. And so, with federal funding cuts, it can be a huge impact to communities, to neighborhoods, right? To states, right?
Yep.
It's really critical that we keep those services around. Not because they need it, but to support and empower them. Yeah.
And even, our group serving dinner, like that might be the only meal somebody has that day, or the only guaranteed meal that day. And so it's more than just like the therapy part. It's just, like I said, the community around it, being able to interact with kids. For some of those parents, that's the only time they interact with other adults or other people who understand them. And so I feel very honored to be able to be a part of that space, and I hope it can continue, because I've seen so many good things come out of it.
I'm so glad we could have this conversation, and kind of to wrap it all up. We know that every child deserves to be safe, and at DAP we really work hard to support families in getting there. So please, if you want to be enrolled in our next session of youth group, call the number on the screen and reach out.
Well, it was really great talking to you.
Yes.
I'll see you at work
in a few minutes.
Yes. Thank you for listening to this podcast, and we will see you next time on the DAP podcast.